This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, producer of the show. This week, Jon Valant of Brookings joins us to break down his recent analysis of the Educational Choice for Children Act and why it could open the door to waste, fraud, and discrimination. Then, on the Research Minute, Adam highlights a Belgian study comparing the effects of work-based versus school-based learning in vocational education. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming this week's special guest, Jon Valant, Director of the Brown Center on Education Policy and Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. Jon, welcome to the show.
Jon.
It's great to have you here. Jon told me I'm always afraid that I'm going to butcher people's names. And especially I'll ask people, how to pronounce their names. And then, David always makes fun of me for getting it wrong anyway. So you say your name rhymes with nonchalant, Jon Valant. Okay.
For better or worse, that is true.
There we go. All right. And I should say my co-host David Griffith on vacation this week sends his regards. He's going to be really bummed that he missed this one. He is a fan of yours, Jon, and probably agrees with you. Actually, I know he agrees with you on much of what we're going to be talking about today. So I was able to be crafty with the scheduling, so I was not 2 against 1 on this podcast. We are going to talk about school choice, and in particular, the federal school choice proposal known as ECA. Jon wrote a great piece for Brookings about that. Actually, you've written a couple of pieces now. I thought that they were so compelling that I solicited a rebuttal from Shaka Mitchell at the American Federation for Children, because I really thought your posts made some very strong cases, and it was just kind of sitting out there winning the argument. So let's dig into all of that today on Ed Reform Update. All right, Jon. So I suspect our listeners are very familiar with the normal debates around private school choice, about pros and cons, funding religious schools or not, schools that, don't have to take everybody, that can discriminate, but also the pros of, hey, Catholic schools, for example, have a proud history of doing a lot of good in this country, and it's a shame that so many of them continue to close, and especially in blue states that don't have private school choice. It would be great to do something to give kids access to schools that are a good fit for them and that their parents might like. What I want to hear about, though, are your particular concerns about this particular initiative that was included in the House Reconciliation Bill, and by all accounts is likely to be included in the Senate version as well. A poll of Education Insiders last week said 65% of them thought this was going to become law. So what is wrong with ECA? Well, we talked about ECA, a couple months ago with Jim Blue, who's one of the big supporters of it. What do you think it gets wrong, and why do you think it's going to be basically a big mess?
Great question. And I think that's a helpful framing, because I think it's important to know that there's room to be in favor of some kind of school choice and still to have some real questions and concerns about ECA in particular. And so that's kind of the space that I'm talking to here. And so ECA is what's called a tax credit scholarship program. And a tax credit scholarship program, to my eye, is kind of a different, more contemporary version of a private school voucher program that I think a lot of people know. And voucher programs historically run into a couple of different kinds of problems. Some of them are legal, where there's some prohibitions on certain kinds of voucher programs. Some are political, where vouchers just haven't been very popular. And so tax credit scholarship programs like ECA, they sort of take this circuitous route where they move money around in kind of a funny way, but functionally they do a lot of what a voucher does. And so what this particular program does, this is a federal program. So this would be coming out of Washington and imposing this on all 50 states with actually provisions saying that no local, state, or federal policymaker can intervene to sort of keep it from working as the federal bill lays out. But it's a federal program where you have money from a donor, and we should come back to what that means, because I'm going to put donor in quotations, because in this case, the way ECA is written, donors make money. They don't actually donate money, they make money. And so we have a donor who gives money to a scholarship granting organization, and then the scholarship granting organization can take 10% of that money for themselves right off the top, and then they'll give that money to families, and the families can use the money to pay for private school tuition or for books or for tutoring or for lots of other things. And my concerns with ECA run pretty deep. I think if I could sort of frame it in one way, it would be to think about ECA in the context of how historically we've treated federal education policy in this country and what really federal education policy has been all about, which I would argue is partly protecting student civil rights. It is partly compensatory funding, so it's getting funds to schools and to families that need it, that would otherwise probably not have enough funds. And it's doing data and research and making sure there's transparency with how our education systems run. The way ECA is set up, it allows, first of all, for an incredible amount of discrimination against certain groups of students. So, for example, a school that receives money through ECA could literally put a sign on the door that says no LGBTQ students, or no kids of LGBTQ parents, or no Democrats, or no Republicans, or no Jewish students, or the list goes on. So there's sort of a fundamental violation of what I think of when it comes to discrimination protections. Second, on the compensatory funding point, the way this policy is set up, it looks very likely that most of the resources would flow to relatively wealthy areas and potentially very wealthy areas. And in particular, it would flow out of rural poor communities, which I think has been a concern with the SA programs and is especially a concern with this program. So you have that violation of kind of how we think about the federal role. And then on research and development and transparency, there's almost nothing in ECA that would actually give us any kind of real vantage point into whether this massive investment, it could be $5 billion, it could be $10 billion, whether it's doing any good, and where are the funds going and how are the funds being used. There's just almost no meaningful transparency at all in ECA as it was written in the House bill.
Okay, so thank you. That was great. Let's unpack some of that. So first of all, this issue around targeting. My understanding is that there is some targeting in the bill in terms of the students that can receive scholarships. There's some means testing, though the cap is pretty high. Is that fair to say? So it is targeted, but at, say, let's say, poor working class and middle class families, some upper middle class families, depending how you quantify that, and very affluent families would not be eligible to receive the scholarships. Is that fair to say?
I don't think that's fair to say, the way it's written. So it is both very high and it's localized. So this gets into the weeds pretty fast. Okay. But basically the way it's set up is you are eligible if you're within 300% of your median household income in your area. So what that means is if you live in a really wealthy area and you're making just less than 3 times as much as the median household in your super wealthy area, you are still eligible for these ECA funds. So there are families that are going to make well more than $500,000 a year that are sitting on a whole lot more wealth than that are going to be eligible for these funds. And the flip side of that is if you live in a poor area and you make just barely more than 3 times whatever the median income is in your poor area, you're not eligible to get these funds. So you get this kind of goofy construction where families that are making a whole lot more money than other families are going to be eligible because they localize that income requirement.
Okay, but so that's your concern about poor rural areas in particular. Although, look, I mean, that again, there's plenty. It's a lot of money. It seems like at least initially, there's going to be plenty of money for, say, poor families in Mississippi to get access to scholarships. And if they're in the rural areas and there's not private schools to go to, they can get it for things that might be homeschooling expenses, right?
But that, first of all, that's an important point, that there just aren't as many private schools in rural areas as there are in urban and suburban. So there are fewer opportunities to use these funds. And I think the question, and I listened to Jim Blue's podcast interview, I thought it was interesting. And Jim, the way Jim talks about ECA and the way a lot of ECA advocates talk about it is that these are just new funds that we're sort of all of a sudden going to see in education that we hadn't seen before, which is a way of framing the trade-offs of this policy that I just don't think is right. And part of that is, so I mentioned before that I think we should put donors in quotation marks. So donors to ECA, the people who are in theory funding this program, let's say that you make $1 million and you want to, in a year or two, that you're going to put into ECA as a donation to a scholarship granting organization. You donate $1 million. So first off, you get a tax credit back for $1 million. So you haven't actually donated anything. You've gotten all your money back. And then on top of that, the way ECA is set up is it's a tax shelter because you can donate stock instead of donating cash. And then you don't pay capital gains taxes. And basically, it's a way of avoiding certain taxes. So the money for this program is coming from somewhere. This is not donors that are funding a program where we're suddenly getting this infusion of cash into K-12 education that we didn't have before. This is coming from somewhere. And now, does that mean it's coming from education? Does it mean it's coming from SNAP? Does it mean it's coming from Medicaid? I don't know. Is it just added to the deficit? I don't know, because there's not that kind of direct communication about where these funds are coming from. But I do think it's important to know that at the same time that we're getting this infusion of $5 billion, $10 billion, it sure feels like the Trump administration and congressional Republicans are looking to squeeze education funding every place else they can. And so when you're talking about how it may be that families can use this money in lots of different ways, I think that's true. But I also think we have to put that in the context of what could we be using these funds for, and what funds that we've had historically might we not have anymore that are instead going to go to this program.
Okay, I get you. But that's pretty indirect, right? And like you say, the money's coming basically from the Treasury, or money that the Treasury is now not collecting. So yeah, I mean, to me, it feels like we're putting it on the credit card like so much else, and that's not great in many ways. But look, let me push you on this, John, which is that for all of what you say, let's stipulate that your take on it is accurate. Still, this is going to finally give a chance for poor and working class kids in blue states, maybe a once in a lifetime chance, to get to go to private schools that they would not otherwise have access to. And for a lot of these families, again, let's go back to Catholic schools. I'm a big fan of Catholic schools. I think the evidence for a long time has been positive. They have a long history of serving immigrant communities, working class communities, going way back to the 1800s. And one of the great tragedies in American education has been watching Catholic schools close over the past 50, 60, 70 years. Finally, in places like Florida, that has a tax credit scholarship program, not so unlike this one, you see Catholic schools finally not closing and in some cases growing again. So if we could do that in Los Angeles, in New York City, in Chicago, in Boston, in some of these other deep blue places where the teachers unions are never going to let the state pass a private school choice program, isn't it at least worth, let's let it play out. Let's see how it goes. And this might do some good for some families who strongly want these options.
I should say to start that I am not one who is categorically opposed to school choice reforms. Like, I think a lot of the opponents to ECA would say any form of school choice, whether it's vouchers, it's charters, it's anything else, they just don't like the feel of it. I'm actually one who believes that families should have some choice, and I do worry about families who have a lot of choice telling other families that don't have choices that they shouldn't. My concerns about ECA partly are just kind of in the weeds in the actual construction of this policy. I think the policy is just very, very poorly formulated. And then I also worry about, as much as I would like to see a robust Catholic school sector, what about the kids who aren't Catholic, who are told if you're in an area that's predominantly Catholic, and if this is the way now that federal education funds are going to flow, and you're Jewish or you're Muslim or you're whatever other faith you may be, and you're told not only are most of these funds going to those Catholic schools, but you can't get them because you aren't Catholic. And I think that just violates the spirit of the way that we have funded schools with public money.
Yeah, no, I hear that. And of course, we got a Supreme Court case. So we're waiting on the decision soon in my home county, Montgomery County, Maryland, where, there's parents, many of them Muslim parents, who feel strongly that the public schools were teaching things in the curriculum, in the English language arts curriculum, that went against their religion, right? And they were being forced to send their children to public schools that were in violation. And so, this is part of this bigger picture, right? How do we create a system where everybody can find a place that is a good fit for them and their children. And can we make sure that there is a public school, neighborhood school option that is a good option as a backup, at least, or as something that a lot of people want? But figure out how to make sure that those schools are not violating people's religious practices and beliefs. So, in other words, let's take the big view. We want a pluralistic system. I think we should have a pluralistic system, right? And we should have a system where everybody finds a home. That doesn't mean necessarily that every school is a great fit for everybody. Okay. That said, look, I'm uncomfortable too with the notion that Catholic schools are telling gay kids or kids from gay families that they're not welcome. That doesn't feel great either. But again, that's a trade-off. That's about pluralism. And this is a question about these trade-offs. And John, I mean, what do you say though? The last question, it is a weird construction. There's no doubt. The reason it's constructed like this with the tax credit is because this is the way Republicans can pass this program on a party line vote. It can be in the reconciliation bill because it's a tax, policy. They could never get it done with 60 votes, at least, unless they, somehow, get to the point where Republicans sweep the Senate big time and have, a filibuster-proof majority. Again, blue states are never going to do something like this because of opposition from the teachers unions and others. So, on a trade-off perspective, if we could figure out a way to design it better, then is this trade-off worth it? And finally, but would you say with the program we're actually looking at, you would just tell people, hey, this is not worth supporting at this time?
I mean, where I am on this is I agree that ultimately we need that big picture. We need to make sure that every kid is in a good school. I don't think there is a path to that end outcome that doesn't involve a really strong public school sector. Mm-hmm. And what I worry about when it comes to this newer generation of private school choice reforms is that they are just inherently hostile toward public schools in ways that I don't think all of the school choice reforms of years past have been, or at least not to this extent. And what I really worry about when it comes to, and now I'm talking both about ECA and I'm also talking about the state ESAs and just to sort of move to big universal private school choice programs, I worry we end up in a place where we have a terribly stratified school system where we have private schools that are serving families with wealth. And even if we're giving vouchers, we're giving scholarships, whatever it is to some families, it's usually not going to cover the full cost of attending those schools. And so for wealthy families, they're going to go to those private schools. For poor families, they're going to be in public schools, unable to get out to those private schools. And that is the story that people who studied Chile's education reforms tell for what unfolded in Chile, which was they did this. They went down the path of a more universal private school choice program, and you ended up with terrible stratification, and the public schools really struggled as a result, and you saw much worsening outcomes in those public schools to the point where they had to go back and really reform that system. So that's what I worry about, and I would say just in to the political point about this, because I do think it's important. And so Shaka didn't like my piece very much, and he wrote on the Fordham site in response to some of what I'd written. And there was one point Shaka made that I very much agree with, and I think we have to pay a lot of attention to, which is that Shaka said this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for passing this kind of bill. And I think that is totally right. And I think that is a reflection of the fact that people don't want this. I mean, as you said, there is no Democrat anywhere who would be willing to vote for a program like this. But even if we just think about Republicans, I think there's a lot of concern among rural Republicans about why this would benefit them. I think there's skepticism about that. I think there are a lot of deficit hawks in the Republican Party who might wonder, why are we putting $5 billion or more into this program? I think we've been hearing from a lot of Republicans about how education should be left to the states. And I mean, I would ask the question of why is it that Washington's going to tell California and Massachusetts, you have to do this program? And there's a provision in ECA 2 that says not only do you have to do this program, but you cannot do anything to restrain those scholarship granting organizations from doing whatever they want. So I think it is absolutely true that the only path that this has to passing ever is if it sneaks into a budget reconciliation bill where it's overshadowed by SNAP and by Medicaid and by Medicare. And in a context where we've had vote after vote that has failed when it comes to these big private school choice programs, like I think we should be listening to people, and the fact that we keep getting no's is maybe indicative that there's something about these policies that people just don't like and don't want. So this would not be my formulation, even as someone who does think that we should be trying to find ways to make sure that families have some options that they like.
Very well said, John. We will leave it there. Jon Valant, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. John, director of the Brown Center on Education Policy at the Brookings Institution. We got to do this again sometime soon, maybe on a different topic.
Love to. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Thanks, John. Now it's time for everyone's favorite Adams Research Minute. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back.
So for those of you who are listening instead of watching, you do not know that Adam is wearing his Oklahoma City Thunder hat.
Go
I guess
Thunder.
you're going to the big game, huh?
It's exciting times. Two tied final series. And I don't know, did you see the last game, Mike?
That was the one game I didn't get to see, but yes, very exciting. Now we're taping this on Monday. This is going to come out on Wednesday.
Yep. They'll know.
So we'll see what's happening, but no, it's great. Hey, it's so fun to have a close series and some exciting finishes. So we will root for another one.
Yeah, I mean it's like both teams are playing full court the whole time. I've never seen like NBA basketball like that. It's almost like watching a high school or a college game or something with the level of intensity.
Right.
It's
It is.
pretty good to watch.
Finally, you got to get to the finals and then they really try hard.
Yeah,
and it's
right.
fun. We should figure out
How to
how
make
do we
them do that for
incentivize
the whole season?
Yeah, exactly. More of that. Well, they probably couldn't keep their poor bodies would break down if they tried to do this the whole season, but something in that direction. But hey, we don't talk about incentives for basketball players here on the Education Gadfly Show.
Why
we talk
not?
about incentives for educators and students instead. What you got for us this week?
All right. Well, in much less exciting news, we've got a study that looks at the effects of work-based learning in vocational education versus school-based learning. So the study is based in Belgium, but despite that, I'm always hearing education reformers saying that the Europeans do vocational education better than we do. So I thought it might make sense to check in on one of those countries, especially since this new paper was just published in Economics of Education Review. So there's this perennial discussion in both the US and Europe alike about how we need to make education more relevant, give students real world experience, apprenticeships, internships, learn and earn. These are increasingly seen as solutions to youth disengagement, unemployment. This study from Belgium adds some evidence to that debate that should encourage, I think, a more nuanced view of some of these programs. So the researchers, who are based at the Catholic University at Leuven in Belgium, use rich longitudinal data from a Belgian cohort of students across 48 schools who were in the 7th grade in 2014 and graduated high school in 2019. They use that data to investigate what actually happens when school-based learning is replaced by work-based learning. Now, this isn't a generic vocational versus academic comparison. They're comparing students within vocational programs who receive different amounts of on-the-job training. Belgium has another more purely academic track that lots of students are on, but they're not a part of this study. So the researchers are looking at the share of work-based learning for students in the other biggest tracks, a technical track, which blends vocational and in general education and often leads to college, and a more pure vocational track, which is more focused on going directly into the workforce. The outcomes that they look at include cognitive outcomes, including standardized math, literacy tests, and non-cognitive outcomes, which come from student surveys and are distilled into different dimensions such as motivation and engagement. Okay, so what are the findings? For the technical track, that's the one that's more mixed and often leads to college. The effects of work-based learning are mostly negative. Students in technical programs who spend more time in work-based learning score worse on standardized numeracy and reading comprehension tests. A student doing the average of about 4 weeks of work-based learning, for example, shows a substantial drop in numeracy compared to other students. It's about 40% of a standard deviation. But part of the promise of vocational education is that we think these students will pick up work skills and life skills and be more engaged. Unfortunately, they don't find any evidence for that for those technical track students either. Those students are actually less motivated, less engaged, and report lower well-being in school when they spend more time in work-based learning and away from school. For the students on the vocational track, that's the one that's aimed directly at employment. The effects of work-based learning are much more positive. There aren't strong academic impacts for those students like there were for the technical track students, those negative impacts. There's none of those, or at least they're like very inconsistent and small. And that's especially true for moderate amounts of work-based learning. But the non-cognitive effects are positive. Most notably, and I'll end with this, students in the track show a massive reduction in what the researchers call amotivation, basically just giving up at school. A 4-week internship reduces amotivation by about 85% of a standard deviation. That's a pretty big effect. But again, that's only positive for those students on the vocational track.
Wow, this is really interesting, Adam. Do we know, are the students on the vocational direct to work track, do they have lower student achievement to begin with?
Yes, they do.
Okay. And that makes sense. Look, I hate to say it, this confirms my priors, okay, which is that work-based learning for students going into work makes a lot of sense. It makes less sense for students going into college. And this is important because in our debate in America, there are very few of us, I would say, who are comfortable saying, look, we should allow kids to choose college or career at some point. Maybe not till after 10th grade, let's say. But let's allow them to make that choice. And there are others, including people in the career tech world, who are saying, no, it should always be college and career. We should have more work-based learning, regardless of where you're going, whether you're going into work or college. And I think what this shows is, there's some real trade-offs, not surprisingly, at play. And that, if you're a kid who wants to be on that more traditional college prep path, if you are spending less time doing math and literacy, you're going to learn less math and literacy, right? And you've got time. You're not going to be in the workforce for a long time. There's time for you to get that experience, when you're in college, summer internships or other things down the road. Whereas if you're, much closer to that workplace piece, getting that work experience can make a big difference on motivation, which is important. Of course, these kids are demotivated, they're bored, they've given up. I mean, this sounds a lot like what I think is happening in America as well. I don't know. I mean, is that your take also, Adam?
Yeah, so it's just for context, around 2013, which was right at the beginning of this study, that's when these students were kind of getting ready they were in middle school at that time. Belgium changed the law and started requiring some work-based learning for students in those two tracks. So there's kind of like three big tracks. There's the academic track, which this study ignores, and that's over a third of students who do that more purely academic track. Then you got the technical track, and then the kind of vocational track. And so we're looking at those other two. And so, yeah, the question is like for those students, I mean, we talking about CTE a lot of the time, and I think it's a little unclear to me sometimes. It sounds like people talk about the technical track. It sounds like kind of like the Belgian technical track, but then we're also trying to figure out solutions for students who are lower achieving and who need options besides college. And so that sounds like more like the vocational track. And so I think what we learned from this study, to the extent that it goes beyond Belgium, is that for those students who are maybe most disengaged and most, they're almost certainly not going to go to college. And there are a lot of students in high school who will just say, I'm not going to college. For those students, work-based learning seems to be pretty good. And then it's a question of like, what about the CTE programs, these hybrid things? How much of that should be work-based and how much of it should be school-based? This study, I think, is talking mostly about those students and giving us warnings about them.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. And that is the more typical route that we see in America. There's very little work-based learning going on. There's enthusiasm for it. a lot of logistical barriers to making it happen, it's probably a couple of percentage points of kids that are doing much of that. Much more common is that students are doing basically college prep and then taking a career tech course or two on the side as electives, right? And then, so maybe, how important is it to get those kids work experience? Look, we desperately need to figure out for our lowest achieving, least engaged kids in high school. We've had this big push on making sure they don't drop out, which is probably good because, at least they're still connected to the school. But can we find some ways to get them into work? And with support as a way to keep them motivated, engaged, and give them those skills that they're going to need when they're 18 and they're now on their own. Always time down the road. We are good in America at second and third chances.
Totally.
They decide they want to go to college later, fine. But forcing them to do this death march through academic courses when they're 16, 17, 18 and are completely disengaged, because equity, because we're worried of, it's not the right way to go, in my opinion. And I'm so glad now I have a Belgian study to back me up on that.
Well, those second and third chances, I really believe in those too. I think a lot of kids can change trajectories. They might be disengaged and someday they engage. But in the United States, we just don't have a big access problem in most places. Most places, you can go to a community college with just a high school diploma and you can get into a good flagship university after that. Most places around the country, that's the case. And so we're not shutting down doors if by letting you go do some work-based learning in high school. In fact, for a lot of the students, they may really not like school, and having an option to actually go out and do something might get them more engaged with school. And that's kind of the evidence here, is that the students were a lot more engaged. They were a lot less likely to just feel like dropping out when they were able to do something that wasn't just classroom-based.
All right. Well said. We will leave it there. That is all the time we've got for this week. So until next week,
I'm Adam Tyner.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.